sort of briefly go through the analysis of what the impact of the expiry of the post 85 operating agreements will be, and then talk a little bit about how I think this creates an opportunity for the association to actually think about how to transform yourselves into a different way of doing business, a more social enterprise type approach, as opposed to a purely non-profit, government-dependent, subsidy-dependent kind of set of providers. And so in terms of the piece of work that Christina originally asked me to do, it was, I think there were some issues in Manitoba in terms of a position from the Manitoba Housing that when the federal subsidies and well, cost-shared federal provincial subsidies expire with your operating agreements, that projects would be fine and they wouldn't need any further help. So the intent of this project was to actually examine that particular perspective and figure out if it was true, which turns out it's not, and to identify what could actually be done, both in terms of sort of technical responses and also advocacy positions that the organization might take. So in terms of the methodology, Christina and Beth surveyed the membership and were able to collect data, fairly basic data from your annual financial statements for 49 projects out of, I think there's 69 nonprofits and 11 co-ops in Manitoba. So this was about 2/3 of the portfolio, so reasonably representative. 10 or 15 years ago now, I had produced an analytical tool to help folks sort of think about the impacts of expiring agreements downstream. And I guess back when we did that tool, it was far enough away that people didn't take it too seriously and perhaps didn't do the analysis. But I've utilized the tool here anyway. And what it essentially does two tests. It says, when the subsidy agreement expires, which is coincident with the maturing of the mortgage. So you no longer have mortgage payments and you no longer receive subsidy. So those two things actually happen at the same time. And so what the assessment tool does is it assesses, are you viable, i.e. do you have positive cash flow after those two things happen? And are your existing capital reserves and your need for capital replacement, the amounts that you need to do that, do you have sufficient reserves and ongoing contributions to allow you to spend a proxy amount, which is $1,000 per unit per year, to undertake capital renewal? That was a sort of a rough approximation based on some engineering studies. I think it's a simple test, and it does need to be augmented with more detailed building condition assessments, but for the purpose of this analysis, that's what I used. And you can see here in the matrix, the projects will end up in one of four quadrants. The green light is if you've got positive NOI and you've got sufficient capital reserves. The opposite extreme is you have insufficient capital reserves and you have negative income. So that's the worst case scenario. In some cases, you may be in a situation where you don't have enough capital reserves, but you do have positive cash flow, and therefore you can take that to the bank and borrow to finance some repairs. And conversely, where you may have good reserves, but you don't have sufficient revenues to operate on a break-even basis. So that's sort of the base of the assessment. One of the key, and perhaps why the province was thinking about that this, there wouldn't be a problem, is because for the projects that expired prior to the post-85 projects, anything that was built essentially from 78 to 85, the subsidy model then was one with a reduced mortgage rate, and by definition, the nature of subsidy, the mortgage payment was always bigger than the subsidy. So when both expired, that should actually have a positive effect. The post-85 projects, which we're now just starting to see expire because these projects started to be committed and built in 1986. And if you do the math, 86 and 35 years is 2021. So we're just getting into the period where this portfolio of projects are starting to expire. And there was a change in 1985 when the projects were part of the transfer to the provinces. The provinces were encouraged to cost share and deliver the programs, but it moved away from the mixed income model of the pre-85 period to 100% RGI. And because you were 100% RGI, and the nature of subsidy was that the subsidy was bigger than the mortgage, by definition, when those two things expire, it should, in most cases, leave you in a worse situation. So this basically The chart is the sort of expiry. So you've seen a couple of projects have already expired or expiring this year. And then we get, 5, 4, etc. Kind of a peak year coming up there in 2025, where you've got, more or less, 12. So a significant number of projects and units will be expiring by then. So obviously getting some remedies in place in negotiation with the province is quite important. This is a bit of a busy chart. You can kind of ignore it. You won't be able to find yourself on there because everything is coded. But basically, the story is when the lines go down, or the columns go down below zero, it's negative operating income. And there's a couple of projects that are positive. The 5 viable projects are kind of unique. They don't have 100% RGI, or they've expired and have raised their rents and are in a more positive operating circumstance. But in the main, most of the projects, 43 or 49, have negative operating income, and they would require subsidy to cover off that shortfall of around about $2,000 a year or $170 a month to make them whole, so they would continue to be viable. Capital reserves, similarly, using the proxy measure of do you have enough reserve and enough ongoing contributions to be able to spend $1,000 per unit per year on capital replacement. Only 3 or 4 of the projects just reached that benchmark. Most are around about the $600 mark. So there's a shortfall there. And without some access to funding for capital renewal, you won't have enough money in the bank or in your reserves to actually do the necessary capital renewal to keep the buildings in good condition. So this is the overall summary. Not particularly rosy news. As I mentioned, you really don't want to be in the bottom right-hand quadrant. It turns out pretty well all of you are. There's a couple that are not, but they're either in the sort of the 2 amber boxes that are not particularly viable. So overall, this entire sample, which is 2/3 of the portfolio, the entire portfolio is at risk if we don't find a remedy that corrects for the expiry issue. One of the things that happens, of course, is because the mortgages are expiring and a lot of the subsidy was basically associated with helping you pay your mortgage payments. If there is any subsidy, it's significantly lower than it was before. And we can see here at the year of expiry, we needed essentially $7 million of subsidy a year. That goes down to 2.4 million as a result of the no further need to pay mortgage payments. As I mentioned at the outset, the approximation of the slide there on the adequacy of reserves is a crude general rule of thumb approximation, and it's strongly recommended that each provider undertakes building condition assessments to really figure out what their capital plan is and their capital replacement needs are, and then we can adjust that amount on a per project basis, and that may adjust the amount that you actually need to increase your reserves by when we try and figure out, what would be a break-even rent going forward that fully makes sure you have enough subsidy to address the lack of rent because you've got folks paying RGI rents, and also gives you enough funding to cover your capital needs. This is kind of a little bit tangential, but it's an important feature of the subsidy mechanism that because and I'm not going to get into the technical details on this, they're in the paper, but basically we have a conundrum when we have folks who are on employment income assistance and they're on RGI, because both are formula-based subsidies, both require variables such as what is your total income, what is your rent, and because the shelter component of welfare asks you what your rent is, but when you're in RGI, you need to know what your income is first, and you don't know your income until the EI guys tell you what your total benefit is. There was an administrative decision made by all the provinces to basically administratively set rents in income assistance programs, and they all chose to set those rents extremely low because that way the federal cost sharing subsidies was actually offsetting expenditures in the provincial budget. So it was fiscally smart on the part of the provinces, but has consequences at the project level. And what it really means is you collect much less rent from the folks who are on income assistance than you do from the working poor. And also that if that same income EIA household was living in the private sector, they would be eligible to receive up to the maximum amount of the shelter component, and the private landlord will get a lot more revenue than you will. And therefore he's able to maintain his building better than you would be. And we do see this in the average rents in this portfolio, the difference between the seniors projects where you're generating rents of almost $600 a month versus family projects where it's only 405. And that's really pulled down by the weighting of about 35% of the households in your family projects happen to be recipients of EIA. And I only raise this because it is a consideration when the agreement expires. You are no longer social housing. You're a non-profit housing provider, a rental housing provider, and because you're no longer, if the province took the position that they're not going to give you any more subsidy, therefore you're no longer covered by this regulated rent. And you can now actually move your rent to the maximum shelter component of welfare. So in this case, for a single, you could move the rent from $285 a month to $576. The tenant wouldn't be impacted by that because they would basically, it would be a flow through. But you as the provider would collect almost $300 a month more in rents. So it is a potential negotiating tactic to use with a province if they actually took the position that they're not going to extend subsidy. It wouldn't help all projects. It would only help those where you had a significant number of EIA recipients, and so wouldn't really help seniors projects, but it would be a partial solution for some of the portfolio. So that's sort of the nature of the problem and sort of the, as I say, that tangential additional issue around income assistance payments. So how do we actually solve this problem? What are the opportunities to do something differently? Well, it turns out that in the National Housing Strategy, there is, everybody knew this was going to happen. And the National Housing Strategy intentionally created a funding stream called the Canada Community Housing Initiative to provide a cost-shared pot of money to the province. So it's funded 50-50 by the federal government and the province, specifically to address the expiring agreements and to basically replace the expiring subsidy and to provide capital to do necessary capital replacement. So we do have a specific program to do this. The issue here is that the province has a grossly underfunded portfolio of public housing and may want to keep some of that money just for its public housing and not share it across the non-profit sector. And the budget for that particular program ramps up each year in association with the phasing of expiries. So as the federal expenditure goes down on current subsidy, they say, okay, we'll now increase the amount of funding we're going to put into this future program, if you will, to make sure folks can still be viable. So there is a case to be made that it should be aligned with the projects that are expiring, and the non-profit sector should get its share of that particular pot in proportion to the rate of expiry of those particular properties. And certainly, if we look at the bilateral agreement between Manitoba and Canada or CMHC, the budget it increases from about $2 million in 2019-20 up to I think it's close to $6 or $7 million by 2022. So the total over that period, cost shared, it's about $17.1 million, whereas you only need 8.5. If all of your 1,850 odd units had expired, that's how much subsidy you would need with the reduced amount because of the expiry. So that certainly is a source of funding that the province has, and you should be able to negotiate with them to access that for the purpose of sustaining the existing portfolio and making sure that nobody is actually harmed and none of the lower income tenants are harmed by these expiries. That said, I mean, I'll go on and talk about this further, but my view is that I think simply extending subsidy in the way we've always done things perpetuates the status quo. It makes you continue to exist as dependence on the province, dependence on subsidy. It doesn't help you to transform into more independent social enterprises who are still trying to serve a mission of helping poor people, low-income people, but in a way that you can do it differently in a more not commercial, but a sort of more disciplined way that allows you to generate rents and collect rents properly. Did I do that properly? Okay, this is number 2. For some reason, when I changed the slide, I didn't change the number. So the second one is, which I already really spoke about, is changing the way that rents are set for employment income assistance recipients, and instead of using the artificially created extremely low rents that are created in the regulations, to basically change those to actually what it says in the CMHC schedule of the federal operating agreement, that when someone is receiving social assistance, they should pay the maximum shelter component of income assistance, which would be the, the top end of that range rather than this very low range. So I've already sort of spoken about the impact of this, so that it wouldn't affect all projects, but the family projects with a high proportion of income assistance folks in them, it would have a significant benefit. But I think the more important piece here is this is a negotiating tool for you to use with the province to basically say, well, if you don't help us, we're going to basically shift a bunch of expenditures onto your social assistance budget, so you can work with us or not. The third option is to, and this is really part of a transformational process. The key point here is that rent geared to income subsidy is not about housing. If you say to somebody, you shouldn't pay more than 30% of your income for rent, what you're saying is you need to reserve 70% of your income for non-housing. So you've actually got a housing program that's de facto an income assistance program that's helping people with all their non-housing expenditures. And if that's the case, you should actually put the cost onto the income assistance programs, not keep it on the housing program per se. You're fortunate in Manitoba that I think you're the most progressive province in the country in terms of having designed and implemented the rental assistance program, Rent Assist. The 90% of households in core housing need live in adequate and suitable housing, but they just pay too much. So we don't necessarily need to build a home for everybody in need. Providing them with rental assistance can be far more effective and can be done far more quickly for folks in need. I'm not saying there's no need for supply. There are for other reasons, but certainly Rent Assist is a very useful program. Currently, of course, EI recipients aren't eligible for it, nor are you if you're in social housing. What I propose in the paper, and I do an analysis to show that fiscally this actually works, is that you would set rents at a realistic level, and for the purpose of modeling this, I said, okay, let's set the rent to 80% of the median market rent, which also happens to be the benchmark that's used in Rent Assist for the calculation of the assistance amount, and that anybody that, so that's basically what you would charge everybody. In some cases, if you've got market rent, you might charge higher, but that would certainly be the minimum rent. Anyone that can't afford that rent would then be eligible to apply for Rent Assist, and they would get Rent Assist. You as the provider would collect the rents at 80% of the median market rent. So you would collect much substantially more rent revenue than you currently do. This would make you whole. It would allow you to basically collect enough revenue to fully fund your capital reserves, to if necessary, borrow to undertake repairs. It would make you independent of project-based subsidy. And when you have project-based subsidy, it essentially, there's a very, as I'm sure you're all aware, you have to get annual audited financial statements, you have to provide project data reports to the province has to review them, there's a whole bunch of staff time on both sides that is used. So there's a high administrative cost to project-based subsidy programs. By shifting to this one, you've already got a mechanism in the administration of the Rent Assist program to do the RGI piece and make sure what people's individual benefit levels are. Certainly there's a cost to the province of doing that, but they're already doing it anyway. It would reduce significantly the administrative cost for the provider. It also creates the potential to ultimately reform your income assistance program and remove the shelter component and just have a basic living component, and then have the Rent Assist in there as the housing piece for that. So you've got seamless transitions, and folks, when they move off income assistance, you not into great paying jobs, it's usually into precarious employment, and they've become the working poor instead of income assistance households. Separating the basic living allowance from the housing benefit piece of income assistance means that you can actually only give up half. You can give up the basic living piece, but you could keep the rental piece if you still need help with your rent. So it does actually help a transition for folks seeking to move off income assistance into the labor market, into precarious work, but it gives them that sort of safety net, if you will, of being able to pay their rent. And also, if you've got folks that are leaving social housing, moving to the private market, if you've got the same system in social housing as you do in the private market, it's a seamless transition for them to move over. Whoops, somebody's sending me an email with things on it. That I don't know if you're seeing this on your screen, but I've got two screens going, one of which is the pops up my calendar. Sorry about that if you saw it. So this is, I mean, of the four options I'm talking about, they're not mutually exclusive, but certainly number 3 is the one I would most strongly recommend. And in tandem with it, I think in some cases, in many cases, if you set rents, as I've just suggested, at 80% of market rent, median rent, you would actually collect sufficient revenues to probably have enough revenue to top up your replacement reserves and, say, borrow against that excess revenue or surplus revenues. If you don't, accessing a capital funding program to preserve and improve the building could still be tacked on to this. Is another option, and there certainly are programs, both the Canada Community Housing Initiative is intended both to fund capital renewal. So is there's a retrofit stream within the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, which is unilateral federal. And FCM has also got a $300 million fund from the federal government to assist with energy retrofits in social housing as well. So there are various sources of funding to provide you additional resources in the event that you do need to either do a significant energy or retrofit of the buildings and update them. And in some cases, you may be on properties where you're pretty low density and you want to redevelop or intensify the site and add on additional units, and you could use those programs for those kind of things as well. But having a strong balance sheet is a key part of being able to do that in new development, and hence the suggestion that you should try and transform yourselves to be more, what I like to refer to as sort of social enterprises, which are organizations that are run on a quasi-commercial basis. You seek to break even, you seek to generate surpluses, and as some of my colleagues in the UK like to talk about it, the difference is between a non-profit, meaning you break even and don't make an extra dollar, versus actually making surpluses and then reinvesting those surpluses in your mission. So profit for purpose, I think, is a very different concept than not-for-profit, which puts you into a situation where you just don't have any excess revenues or to do other things to support your mission, and you remain highly dependent on government subsidy, which I think, some governments are more sympathetic than others. Governments change, and there's always the risk that government funding can be cut off. It's a lot harder to cut off subsidy to individuals when they're receiving it through rent allowances, rent assist, than it is to cut off program kind of subsidies, which we saw in 1993, when the federal government decided to terminate all new funding for social housing. So I think, again, from a sort of a political sustainability point of view, moving more to a person-based subsidy model than a project-based subsidy model makes a whole lot of sense. And I think, if there are various ways that one could design how this would work with rent assist in the post-85 portfolio. The province, I think, has expressed some concerns in terms of would it be taking on the entire burden for all of these subsidies. But I think you could, rather than just extending the existing rent assist program, you could emulate it and have a parallel system that's within the Canada Community Housing Initiative and funded on a 50-50 cost shared basis, or it could be funded within the Canada Housing Benefit envelope as well, so that sort of set aside from the unilateral provincial initiative of rent assist, and that protects the province against any budgetary pressures that may come from this. But essentially, for folks receiving it, it wouldn't seem any different than if they were on regular rent assist. So that's sort of the suggestion that I think would enable you to basically be a far more sustainable group of providers. And as I say, while you are indirectly getting subsidy from government in the form of the subsidy that flows through the individual, it's a very different conceptualization of subsidy and the way it kind of works and the kind of impacts it has in terms of your administration and operations and culture to some extent as well. I think if it's an organization and a group of providers, if Manitoba Nonprofit Housing Association thought this was a good idea, I think it is important that we actually have sort of a sector support sort of system in place. We certainly see this in other countries. The Netherlands actually is a particularly good example where they've created a sort of almost an insurance, a sector-based insurance mechanism of collecting sector stability premiums from all of the providers. In the case where one or a few providers run into some financial difficulty, they have their own resources to then put in place remedies to help those folks out. Creating an internal reporting system and rather than just cutting folks loose because you're no longer receiving subsidy and there's no reporting requirements, sustaining a system of reporting to actually create a risk management system so you can identify projects that are running into financial difficulty and intervene before they go off the cliff, become projects in difficulty, to try and remedy these types of things. And we certainly see this in the co-op sector through the Agency for Co-op Housing and the kind of work they've done on creating their reporting system. And what it does by collecting data, and not just collecting data on how providers are performing, but feeding that data back in the form of an annual performance report to providers, they can see, well, we're not performing very well. We're ranked out of our 69 nonprofit providers in Manitoba, we're ranked 62. What are the high performing providers doing differently than us in terms of their practices around arrears management or debt collection or annual maintenance costs, those types of things. So you create a culture that tries to learn, and it creates a sort of a culture of continuous improvement and documenting and emulating best practice in the sector. So I think there are a whole bunch of things that can be really effectively done through your provincial association to help you strengthen yourselves as a sector as part of the sort of transformation process. And at the end of the day, you're a stronger sector, both in terms of your negotiating positions with government, but you're also continuing to provide a sound sector-based resource and an important supply and stock of affordable housing for low-income folks. And by becoming more financially self-reliant and generating potentially some surpluses from the kind of moderate rents you're charging, as they do in the UK, many of the housing associations there have created very large reserves of surpluses, which they're actually now using as an equity share in building new additional social housing or affordable housing. So it sets you up for expansion as a sector as well. So that's kind of the story in terms of the analysis. I perhaps emphasized more the transformational nature than I did the actual impact of the expiry, because I think the impact of the expiry is a manageable thing. It's something you can figure out, and I suspect the province would be willing to negotiate reasonable remedies there. But I did emphasize the transformational thing because I think this is a watershed moment for you to utilize this expiry as a kickstart to transform the nature and the culture of the nonprofit sector into one that I think could be more resilient in going into the future. I'll end my talk there and turn it over to comments.
Thanks so much, Steve. I really appreciate the report and the work that you've done on this. I think you presented the background very well, that whenever we would approach Manitoba Housing to say, what's the plan for the end of operating agreements, there was a bit of a debate that seemed strange to me between our members and government about the extent to which these groups would actually be viable after the agreement ends, because as you showed, it's pretty clear from, you can get this from data. So the problem is obvious. The solution is more complicated, and so you've spent a lot of time on that, and this works really well with our next discussion, which is going to be about MNPHA's advocacy strategy, because we want to know the extent to which members support this, and should this inform our advocacy strategy. So if folks have questions, comments, concerns, now is your moment. We really want to hear them.
I'd like to ask Steve. I was around in the Pearson era when these social safety nets became very popular, particularly with regard to housing. And as I understood it then, the intention of the operating agreements, of which I've read many, was that the government of Canada through CMHC had absolute control of the budget and the reserve funds, with the intention being that you can't always trust these community clubs and mom and pop and well-meaning people to manage these properties sufficiently to keep decent rents in place such that the maintenance can be maintained up to market standard, a reasonable standard, and that reserves can be set aside at reasonable amounts. What the province of Manitoba seems to be doing with those of us that are responsible as landlords to our boards, they are not approving sufficient rent, break-even rents, so that the maintenance has been deteriorating, a lot of deferred maintenance. And in the case of one property that my group is responsible for, the reserves have been bled almost completely. We're at the point where we're starting to seek legal counsel and considering going public. Have I misread the intention of the social safety net back when these properties were created?
Right. Yeah, I think you're right, Peter, that there was a degree of paternalism in those agreements that, sort of said, well, in fairness, though, at the time, I mean, CMHC was trying to purposefully create a non-profit housing sector that hadn't really existed, and they were nurturing it by creating resource groups and funding them to help various groups get into building housing for lower income folks who didn't necessarily have a lot of professionalism and experience. So having operating agreements that had some conditions and requirements and reviews, those types of things, probably made sense. I think as providers have matured, as their expertise and capacity has expanded, allowing providers to be more autonomous, to give them greater flexibilities, and of course, when the transfer of the administrative responsibility to the province occurred in 1998-99 in Manitoba, you had the province saying, well, we're the guys paying the freight on this. We're taking CMHC's money and we're putting ours in, so we want to make sure we do our public accountability bit. So I think there's been a bit of an overzealous public accountability for the subsidies that are in there, and high degrees of oversight. I mean, the good news of expiry is you no longer have an operating agreement, you no longer have oversight. So there is a silver lining there, but it does come with a lack of revenue.
James,
thank you very much.
Thanks, Pete. James, I see your hand.
Good morning, Steve. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a couple of questions, I guess. James Heinrichs from Winnipeg Housing. One of the things you talked about is comparing data. And I think we all know that we provide a significant amount of data to Manitoba Housing. Now that data, we really don't get a lot of reports from that. And I guess myself coming from the healthcare sector, and especially the personal care home program in Winnipeg, we could across the province compare our nursing hours of care. We could compare our cost per square footage of housekeeping, all of those types of things. And I think one of the significant challenges that we have as an organization is where the majority of our 40 or 50 buildings are located, which is in the core area of Winnipeg North End. And I think, I guess I'd like to just get your thought on how do we, look at a building is not a building, any way you look at it, because it depends on, I may have a building in Transcona that is managed very differently than a building in the core area versus a building in St. Patel. So how do we move around those types of things, and then getting some true numbers around, how do we manage, how do we compare to others? Because not only do you have to compare numbers, but you also have to look at locations, the type of clients or tenants that you have. And I guess then the second part of that is it may not be easier for some of us to change our rent structures than other areas. So how do you work around something like that? What are your suggestions for that?
I mean, I think Winnipeg Housing Renewal Corporation is sort of a slightly different animal, of course, than the other providers, in that you were a public housing provider, delivering that service on behalf of the province, and ended up, in a situation where, for example, you don't have capital reserves, the sinking funds that the nonprofits were required to have, and you had to expense things annually. So that has contributed to the, first of all, the stock is older, and because you didn't have the money to repair it well, you've run into some challenges there. But so, and I think in terms of the solution I'm proposing of utilizing rent assistance, setting realistic rents, I think when you are setting rents, when I say realistic rents, I mean realistic for the neighborhood in which the project's located. So you wouldn't take 80% of, well, the median in Transcona may be different than the median in Osgood Village, for example. So you, to some extent, by taking local medians, you would actually pick that up. But certainly I would sort of advocate for making sure that you're using representative rents of where the particular projects are, and some may generate less revenues and therefore have less capacity to fund their reserves and replacement than others would. And in those cases, I think that's where the tandem access to capital programs would probably be more important for those types of projects. So that's why I think you don't just need one solution, you need that sort of a combination of solutions that respects those differences so that you can actually adapt around that. Yeah, so I think that's really, I mean, that's sort of, I think that's sort of getting at the point even though you didn't sort of talk about it from a rent side, I think that's kind of where I suspect your concern is. And I think that, you need to do this in a way that is, you are doing project-based specific appraisals of what is a reasonable rent in this case.
Thank you.
I saw a comment from Susan. I don't know, Susan, if you want to speak to that, or if you want me to read it out. But it says that this is prescient and solid information to move forward with. For about 20 years, we've been worried about freedom of government dependence. We need to build capacity in the existing partners. As bigger is not better. Income assistance reform is key to a practical social enterprise. Reserves are key, as we've learned from the condo model.
Yes. I don't think Susan's asking a question. She's just basically saying that I'm brilliant and the ideas are all great. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Susan.
I see John raise his hand. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Christina. John Goslin from Friends Housing. Steve, we've had a building condition assessment and a capital plan created by engineers, and that came up with a requirement for us annually of $3,500 approximately per unit. And that seems to be the big difference for us, comparing ourselves to the plan that you suggest or that you're talking about in your report. Are we way off base? I don't think our building is in that bad condition. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one does have to be cautious with BCAs because the way that BCAs are done, the engineering firm, they're basically saying, if you were a homeowner and you'd put tiles on your roof and they had a 20-year expectancy, you look at your roof in year 19, it still looks pretty good. You say, okay, well, I don't really need to replace that now for another 5 or 6 years. I can wait. So the engineers that do these BCAs, they look at the strict, specified life duration of each component of the capital plan and assume that it's all going to have to be replaced exactly when it should expire. And we all know that and I think I've seen many BCAs. So I think they do significantly. They're being very, very conservative in their estimates in terms of the time at which you actually need to replace items, and they do actually look at the costs, fairly high costs. So I mean, typically, on BCAs I've looked at, I say you could pretty well cut that in half. In terms of being a realistic number, and especially if your buildings, if you have actually maintained it well, it's in good shape. I mean, some buildings are in terrible shape, and they probably do need $3,500 a unit per year. And then I think the strategic question is, if a building's in such poor condition, does it make sense to keep pouring money into that hole? Does it make, particularly if it's in an area where there's potential intensification, is it time to actually renew that asset and try and access funding under the various programs of the National Housing Strategy to either substantially rehabilitate with additional capital funding through the programs, or to knock it down and rebuild at a higher density and help more households? So I think there are a bunch of strategic decisions around that, but the very specific answer is don't take the BCA at face value. Except that it's the worst case scenario is what they're presenting to you.
Okay, thank you. And I had one other thing. We've approached Rent Assist to start planning for our expiry, which is in 3 years from this year. And one of the things that we found out was that the residents that we have, many of whom the ones that are on EIA, but with a disability feature attached to it, are not eligible for Rent Assist.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's the workaround you need to discuss. I mean, and that's one of the
Yes.
reasons I think why the province needs to actually reform EIA as well and use rent assist as a way to sort of separate basic living allowance from this. And this was actually work I did for the Manitoba government back in 1999 when they were doing sort of, they were taking on the federal portfolio. They were thinking strategically about what do we need to do. We made a recommendation at that time that they fundamentally reform the EIA program to do this kind of stuff. And both ministers at the time, one was a conservative minister. When we did the work, he thought this was a great idea, and then the government changed, and the Tim Sale came in as minister, and he thought it was a great idea as well. But because it's complicated, and the bureaucracy basically wasn't willing to sort of move fast enough or in the right direction, that they outlasted the politicians and things didn't get done.
Okay.
So here we are 20 years later still talking about it.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
That does relate to one of the questions I had around one of the key concerns for our sector and our partners is preserving the access for those that currently have RGI subsidies to housing at the same rate. So people on social assistance who are accessing that housing, for us, the bottom line is they need to continue to be able to afford their housing. That's critical. That's why we exist. The question I've had is related to the 80% MMR versus 100% MMR. And if sort of to James' point that a building is not always a building, and sometimes the cost is higher than 80% MMR to break even. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. Is there so you suggested that part of that could be covered through a capital program. So some of those issues relate to the modernization and repair needs, all of those things that could be addressed. Is there a place for like a top-up subsidy or some other mechanism, and what would make sense to work with government on for those buildings where the cost is actually higher than 80% of MMR?
Right. So, I mean, I didn't have local-based rents when I did this, but I mean, looking across the portfolio, it appeared to me that in all cases, 80% of median market rent was going to be more than sufficient to cover a break-even rent, with the exception of, as the example that John provided, where you do have excessive requirements for capital repair, and you would need additional money. So rather than sort of say, well, we need a top-up subsidy, now you're back into the dependent on government for ongoing subsidy game, as opposed to getting the money once by accessing a capital plan to do a major retrofit. I think that kind of gets you in and out more quickly. So I think my suggestion would be to sort of think about it more as a separation. Okay, what do we need to be viable and break even? And does that work in for our local project at the local market rent? Is that going to be sufficient? And I didn't want to go above 80% of median market rent, because that would be punitive for the folks who, if we did go down the rent assist stream, they would not get enough rent to actually, their rents would actually go up. So if we're trying to protect them, holding the rent to the 80% is better. But as I say, so I think it's in all cases that would work, with the exception of where you have very significant capital renewal requirements, and I think that's the better solution, better way to approach it.
I see Dennis has his hand up. Go ahead, Dennis. You're muted.
Still on mute.
It wouldn't be a Zoom call if we didn't say that at least once. Yeah, we can hear you, Dennis.
Okay. Earlier, Steve, in your presentation, one of your graphs showed that a few of the, at least two, possibly three, post-85 agreements have already expired.
Right.
I'm interested in knowing how they've fared. Which one of your remedies did they choose to go forward with? Do you have any information in that regards?
I think the three of the ones, all but one were seniors projects where they already had the higher rents, so they weren't sort of in sort of a dire rent situation as others. And I think of the total portfolio, 5 of them were not 100% RGI. So where they had a mix of market units in there, and therefore their overall revenues were coming up, I think those were the ones that show as being positive. And certainly, when we did the analysis of EOA, I've done many of these analyses over the last 15 years, but we've generally found that where the proportion of rent geared to income units to market units is less than about 70%, let's say, they do tend to be viable. So if you were a provider that wasn't sort of stuck in a situation where you had to have 100% RGI and you found some way to get market rent units in there, and or you have transitioned units on turnover to market-based. In some neighborhoods, particularly, I guess, not to be pejorative about it, but I think, the Winnipeg housing portfolios, you'd be hard pressed to get full market rents in there and attract new tenants. And these, I think, were all in smaller communities where they were able to attract market rate tenants and have market rents. So that made them more viable.
Okay, thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions or comments, if anyone has any. Pete, go ahead.
Just wondering, Steve, if you can come up with any ideas that would incentivize the many of us that are operating small properties to join each other, work with each other to form probably a more viable portfolio with greater resources. The province has been encouraging this, but providing zero incentives. It seems they don't know how to do it. Right. But we are not coming up with great ideas either.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the fact that you're even talking about it is a good thing, Pete. I mean, I think there is generally some reluctance. I mean, a lot of the portfolio, when we created the nonprofit housing sector, as I alluded to earlier, we were trying to get away from large scale public bureaucracies. Big public bureaucracies are bad. Therefore, small scale community based must be good. And that was sort of the ethos of the day. But I think the legacy of that is that we've created a sector of very small fragmented providers. And again, not to be insulting, but I think in many of those providers, they are too small to have enough revenue to hire a strong professional management. They've got a bookkeeper and a janitor, and so they lack that professionalism that we really need to actually have a strong, sustainable sector. So I think the way to do that is to find like-minded boards in some of the organizations and say, well, and this is very, very extensive in the UK, where they've come up with this group structure where they'll merge together a number of organizations, at least for the front, to the back office, the big finance, HR kind of things. And certainly the best example in Canada of this, I think, is McCullough Housing in BC, where they started off as an urban native provider on Vancouver Island. And because they were quite strong and competent and professional, there were a number of other urban native providers who were running into difficulty, and they basically invited in McCullough or perhaps BC Housing actually asked McCullough to go in and help them, and they ended up creating a group structure where they have now projects in Prince Rupert and Williams Lake, and a long way from Vancouver Island. And they provide all those management services. The local organization can still run it. They've got local managers running it, and so that sort of responsiveness in relation to the local tenants is really important. And small organizations are really good at that responsiveness to the tenants piece. It's the bigger professional kind of services they're not so good at. So McCullough, out of their head office, does all those types of things, and they then over time slowly transition the boards of the 8 individual providers so that they actually only had one board for McCullough. So even though they are legal, they still exist as legal separate entities. They operate under the same umbrella. And I think, you could look at that model as something you might try to find in Manitoba if you've got, a half dozen small providers that want to explore that model and sort of see how they could do it. And maybe, you've got 8 providers and they all have one member on the board, and they all retain some control. But then you have a big enough organization and a big enough budget to start hiring a CFO and some professional staff.
Okay, that's great to have a model. I've got a number of professionals together willing to participate in that now, including lawyers, accountants, and engineers.
Great. So, I mean, that was part of it too. I mean, the early evolution of the nonprofit housing program, the expectation was, and you can read it in the original sort of descriptions of the program and in the program evaluation kind of documents, that they thought that compared to the public housing program, this new nonprofit model and co-op program is going to be much more cost effective because we're going to have all these volunteers donating their services. Great in concept, but in practice it hasn't worked out so well. So I mean, I would be more in favor of making sure you've got professional employees, not a board with doing it off the side of their desk that happens to be a lawyer or an accountant.
I agree. Thank you.
No more volunteer property managers. We have time for maybe one more question, if anyone has a question.
And I see Chris there from the Center for Transformations. I think they have given some support to the association already, but as you think about these transformative kind of options, I think certainly Chris would. I don't want to steal his thunder or put words in his mouth, but I think as an organization, they are very interested in enabling these types of transformative things. If the kind of model you're talking about there, Pete, chatting with Chris about it, and to what extent they would support you in sort of trying to both, first of all, research and document what McCullough has done, and then figure out how to adopt it to utilize in your case, would be a potential option for you. Sorry, Chris.
Thanks for outing me there, Steve. Yeah, I was just going to tack on once everyone was done with their questions. Yeah, the center, we have funding available for groups that are looking at strategic planning or various different business case planning aspects. So we're kind of like a pre-feasibility to groups that are looking into maybe doing some bricks and mortar projects or some substantial renovations, because I'm also a regional energy coach. So the regional energy coach aspect, I've talked about this before. Christine has graciously hosted me on that, but the FCM funding that is available for energy retrofits or even new builds that are energy efficient, it really does free up a lot of operating dollars for other aspects of your housing project. So energy efficiency, you don't have to be an organization that focuses on having green in your mandate and vision. I mean, of course, that would be great, but it can be really complementary to everyone's way of doing business. And certainly that's something that I can help groups to help navigate. And although I'm not an employee of FCM, we do work in partnership with them. So yeah, there's certainly lots of things that folks can feel free to give me a call on after. I'd be happy to offer some suggestions. I've already talked to several folks as well that are getting some ideas forming, but by all means, let me know what you're thinking on, and I'll make some suggestions. So yeah.
I'll tell Lisa Kerr she owes me a beer for giving you an advertising opportunity there, Chris.
Yeah, and Steve's recommendation in the report. So the report is available on our website.